What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. I've been doing the title question for about a week now, so I think I have a big enough sample size. It's fairly evenly split, with slightly more people saying they'd prefer the Megamix title, so we will be sticking with that for now. I did see some confusion. The Megamixes on the weekdays are all news stories, as well as I can keep track of at least. Please remember that I do read about 2,000 stories a year, so I'm not going to be able to keep track of all of them all the time. There will be some repeats every now and again, although I do my best to make sure that doesn't happen. There were also some people complaining about the amount of ads in recent videos. I don't really know what to tell you guys about that. I've not really changed the frequencies of my ads at all in the entire time I've been doing YouTube, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. With all that being said, if you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those helps the video to do well, and the channel to do well, and ensures I can keep making these videos for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as reading your guys' comments is one of my favorite parts about doing these videos, even if I don't respond to them often since I'm so busy. Last but not least, if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do, there should be a join button somewhere around the subscribe button. It's only $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons to use when you comment, and a special symbol next to your name. No content is locked behind the paywall. It's simply something you can do if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Without further ado, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll get right into the video. When we're kids, we don't always listen to the adults around us. Part of growing up requires us to push on boundaries, or we'd never know when we go too far. It's just a fact of life. Adults already know this, and they try their best to let us learn on our own. Even then, though, they wouldn't hesitate to put their foot down in the best interest of your safety. I know this now, and I did the same with my kids when they were young. However, there was a time when you couldn't tell me anything. I constantly pushed those boundaries and never learned from my mistakes. That is, until I almost died in my youth. I was very much a handful. Too much for my mother, in fact. My dad had been shot down and killed in Vietnam when I was only 2 years old. My mother didn't date after, and both my grandfathers had also passed away. I lacked any male role models in my life. My mom tried to teach me, but she just couldn't do a very good job filling this role. This was another time, mind you, and my mom was just a small-town, simple lady. I was old enough to know she was overworked and not exactly the assertive type. Naturally, I exploited this. I had not yet fallen into crime, but she feared that I soon would. She searched out a solution to my behavioral problems, and soon came up with what seemed to be a perfect one. Spring break would soon arrive, and she would need someone to look after me during the day. This is when Dad's mother, Granny Jean, came into the picture. Mom and Granny Jean never saw eye to eye, but they kept things very civil. I'd soon discover Granny Jean seemed to be just what I needed. She'd grown up during the Depression, and that made her a tough, no-nonsense type of woman. She had no time for foolishness, but was capable of showing genuine love and kindness whenever appropriate. The two spoke on the phone, and she agreed to take me in for the week. I left for the farm on that Sunday morning, and arrived by bus later that day. A daunting trip for a lone 9-year-old. Not that I would have admitted it to anyone. Granny Jean picked me up at the station, and we drove the 25 miles back to the farm in silence. I say in silence, but there was a preacher talking on the radio for most of the ride. I tried to speak up once until I got the stink eye from old Granny, and figured I'd be better off just not talking. Not until breakfast the following morning, actually, did she ever truly talk to me. Afterwards, I received a quick lesson in feeding the animals, and then I was left to entertain myself. Naturally, I took off in search of trouble. Most of the day was spent walking the fields and exploring these woods. I returned briefly for lunch, then renewed my explorations. Around 4 o'clock or so, I came across an old abandoned farmhouse. A massive thing, 2 stories with a big wraparound porch. I just couldn't resist. I quickly looked through the windows to make sure no one was inside. Seeing nobody, I walked around back and entered. There wasn't much to see, but to me this was like a giant clubhouse. It was getting quite late, so I left with the intention of returning. That evening at dinner, I happened to make mention of that old abandoned house. No sooner than I said it though, Granny Jean jumped down my throat. "That's not your property. Don't you go back there. It's old and dangerous. It's not safe. You understand me?" I was terrified by her sudden reaction, and sheepishly said, "Yes, ma'am." I was shocked at my own sheepishness. I'd not been in the habit of respecting my elders, but she was in full control, and she knew it well. Well, almost full control. That night, as I lay in bed, all I could think about was that old house I'd found. There was still so much to explore. I had to go back, and so I did the next morning, stealing a flashlight on my way out. Beginning where I'd left off the day prior, I climbed the creaky stairs to the 2nd floor. Had I been smarter about the layout of old houses, I would have tried to explore the attic, but I didn't realize it was there at the time. I did encounter a door that likely led to it, but it was locked, so I moved on. I still had much more to see. Having found nothing of note at this point, though, I returned to the kitchen. A door I hadn't tried yet was located there. It was extremely difficult to open, but after a few hard yanks it broke free. Ahead of me were these dark stairs leading into a basement. The darkness before me beckoned me down into it. With my borrowed flashlight in hand, I descended those old stairs. One step had long since rotten away, and I jumped. It was a miracle the step I landed on didn't snap as well. Eventually reaching the bottom, I swept this large room with the beam of light. I couldn't see much from my position, therefore I made the mistake of taking a closer look. I took 2, maybe 3 steps, when the door above me suddenly slammed shut behind me. I'm not sure what caused it to close. A gust of wind was the most likely guess. But I was almost positive that as soon as I'd started going down the stairs, I'd already closed the door behind me. I mean, I could have been wrong, I guess. I was never good about closing doors, so no matter how improbable, it was still a possibility. I didn't want to spook myself out with any outlandish theories. I drilled back up the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I threw myself against the old door, but it wouldn't budge. Again and again I did this, but to no avail. I was completely trapped. I began to panic. Then, suddenly I remembered the big swinging doors I'd seen when I arrived. Frantically racing back down, jumping steps in pairs, the second to last broke under my weight, sending me tumbling across the floor. The room was now complete darkness. I realized my flashlight wasn't working. I shook it rapidly and banged it against things, and it would flicker back to life briefly over and over again. I returned to my feet and renewed my sprint to freedom. The doors were 2 heavy wooden things that opened out. I needed a lot of power to budge them. I summoned all my strength and threw my body against them, but nothing. I repeated this twice more until I was too tired to continue. I took a break and tried to think. I closed my eyes and concentrated intensely. I tried to picture the doors outside as I'd seen them the day before. My mind's eye scanned every inch, every nail, every single board, and all the hope I had disappeared in an instant. I remembered a large board straddling the doors from the outside, a sturdy 2x4 or something of similar size, spanning the entire breadth of the opening, slightly under 4 metal braces. I wandered back and forth around the room, examining every square inch in the little light I could receive. There were a couple of small windows, it seemed. Perhaps if I broke those, I could squeeze out. A nearby brick was put into use, but it simply bounced off the panes. I found out later it was reinforced storm-proof glass. No matter the amount of foolish optimism I embodied, as the hours passed by, my courage began to fail me. Things wouldn't truly begin to suck until the night came though. Although the days had always been somewhat warm, the night dipped below freezing. As the sun set down, the basement became colder and colder. To make things even worse, just after 11 p.m. or so, the flashlight gave out completely. Shaking it no longer worked. With no moonlight, it was now completely pitch black. Rats began to scatter all around me, and now I was at the lowest point in my young life. My surroundings terrified me more than the thought of freezing to death. Visions of rats gnawing on my limbs, being too weak to move, overwhelmed me. Sleep became harder and harder to avoid. I knew, though, that if I did fall asleep, I might not ever wake up again. I had no doubt that help would be coming sometime, but would they reach me before I froze? Or even worse, was eaten by rats? Sometime in the early hours of the next morning, I lost the battle and slipped into unconsciousness. In that sleep world, I could almost feel my soul being carried upward. I was no longer shivering. My body was now suddenly warm, and it was no longer painful either. I thought to myself that I was going to heaven. I awoke the next morning, but rather than heaven, I was back in bed. The smell of baked things floated up from the kitchen, and it was all very disorienting. Had I simply dreamed everything? I looked around, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sun was shining through the white lace curtains. Granny Jean's cat was curled up in the chair watching me. I was wearing my favorite flannel pajamas and all seemed well. But just below the surface, something bothered me. I slipped quietly into my robes. As I stepped down the stairs, the rotten stairs of that basement flashed in my mind. Maybe I was in hell or something, a proper punishment for an unruly child like myself. I expected to be swarmed by a horde of rats at any moment. The cat ran ahead of me and turned the corner. I braced for the gruesome onslaught, but it never came. Looking to the left, I could see Granny Jean, her back to me. She sat down at the kitchen table. I stood and watched for a long time, feeling a tug of tension lurking just below the surface. A few minutes passed and Granny Jean turned to me, kindly wishing me a good morning. "Are you hungry?" "Yeah," I answered with a quick jerk. I stood still and watched as she gathered the food. "I don't think we need to discuss what happened last night. You're safe now, and I'm sure even a boy as stubborn as you learned his lesson." The relief was indescribable. I fought back tears, but a few escaped, the warmth now even more soothing. I didn't want her to see me crying, so I turned my back to her and spoke. "No, ma'am, I've seen now just how difficult I've been. I'm sorry." And that was it. Granny Jean plated up my breakfast and we sat together as I ate, not speaking. The remainder of my visit, I stayed pretty close to the farm. I had meant every word I said that morning. It was like a veil had been lifted. All the trouble I'd caused was revealed to me. The adults around me only had the best in mind for me. Yet all I ever heard in my youthful mind was no. It was like the old version of myself did die that night. When the week came to an end, Granny Jean drove me back to the bus station. As we parted, she gave me a kiss on my cheek. I'd never felt so grateful in my life. I still hold a very special place in my heart for her. When I was about 16, I needed to get a job. I was out of high school and living with my parents who were driving me insane. I needed to get out. I was applying for jobs everywhere I could find. I would walk into a store and immediately ask if they were hiring. I didn't really care where I worked. I just needed the money to get out of my current living situation. The local grocery store was having a mass hire job fair type deal on a specific day and time. I woke up early, got ready, and went. Everyone looking to get a job had to stand in a line and wait to be interviewed. No big deal. I just fumbled with my phone while I waited. The guy in front of me was standing sideways, so he could easily face me and anyone behind me. He continually asked me questions like, "Is this your first job? How old are you? How far would you have to drive to get to work here?" After the last one, I sarcastically told him I didn't know he was the person that was supposed to interview me. I thought he got the point because he stopped talking to me soon after. We got further up in line, and finally he was being interviewed in the little office. It was really just a set of tall pieces of cardboard that gave the illusion of privacy during your interview. It was set up right in front of the grocery store too, so anyone walking outside could see you during it. I was getting nervous because I really wanted the job. When he got done and came out, he said, "Hope you get the job, cutie. I'd love to see more of you." He walked past me. If it weren't for the interview coming up, I probably would have told him to get lost. Anyway, I get into the makeshift cubicle or whatever. The guy hands me some papers and tells me to fill them out. I do so and hand them back to him when I get done. When I lifted my head up, I saw behind the man interviewing me was that same creep from before, standing a little bit away trying to hide and watching me during my interview. I had already been reasonably anxious before, but now I was starting to really worry. I tried my best to make it through without looking at him and answer the questions I was being asked. Occasional glances toward that man, though, rewarded me with witnessing the creep groping the glass, having his hand down his pants, and dashing off. Finally, he began to take pictures of me with his phone. I was ready to call the cops as soon as I got out of there, if he was still around. When my interview was wrapping up, I was given some pamphlets and a gift card for a few bucks off groceries. I shook hands with the interviewer, and when I looked back at the window, the man was no longer there. Relief washed over me. I went to leave, and hoped to God I didn't just fuck up my interview because of that distraction. I walked through the grocery store back to the door I'd entered in, and shortly after walking outside, I saw the man leaning up against the wall, waiting for me. I pulled my keys out and put them in between my knuckles like I was taught to do at a young age. My other hand went straight to my pocket, grabbing hold of my phone. I started to walk towards my car. As I walked past him, he stepped to walk beside me. "So, how'd it go?" "You're really too cute to be working at a grocery store, you know. You'd make a lot more money without even having to leave your house if you just went online." It was disgusting, but I said nothing. "Oh, so you're gonna be like that, huh? Not gonna say anything to me? Probably a good idea, because if you open that mouth of yours, I'd be tempted to stick my..." I cut him off by swinging around towards him and punching him in the throat with my key fist. Unfortunately, my grip on my keys weren't tight enough, and they fell out of my hand on impact. That was enough to shut him up though and get him choking. I grabbed my keys off the ground and sprinted for my car. He was following after me, calling me a fucking bitch and other vulgarities I can't remember. I jumped into my car and locked it just in time as he began to slam his fists on my driver's side window. I was shaking like crazy. I pulled out my phone, and after a few feeble attempts from my shaking hands, I correctly dialed 911. He was pounding on my window, shouting about how I assaulted him, trying to open my doors, walking around to see if any of the doors were unlocked. I tried my best to talk to the dispatcher and tell them where I was at. When he got back to my driver's side door and continued to pound on it and cuss at me, I held my phone up to the window. He could see I'd dialed 911. On that note, his face went white, and he looked around and casually walked away. I waited a bit before telling the dispatcher I thought he was gone. They didn't want to send out a patrol if he'd already left. The dispatcher got the description of the man from me, and told me they'd have someone come out and look at the grocery store's camera footage. They would talk to the guy who interviewed me as well, to see if they could find out who the guy was. I never heard from the man again. And thankfully, to my knowledge, as I frequent this store quite regularly, the man did not get the job. Unfortunately, neither did I. This happened in New York City. Years ago when I was a freshman in college, I was out partying one night with some friends. I wasn't drunk or on any hard drugs or anything, but I definitely smoked a blunt or two. Around 3 a.m., we decided to go our separate ways. I got off the train and began my long walk home. I had to take an even longer route home that night too, because some of the train lines happened to be under maintenance. When I got off the train, I realized I would have to walk past the cemetery, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. I wasn't afraid for any particular reason though. It was about 10 blocks and then I'd be home. I always saw trucks lined up on the cemetery blocks, and it being a desolate area, I assumed it was truckers parking their trucks by the cemetery to take naps or sleep before continuing on their routes. Back then, I didn't really give it much thought. A few minutes after getting off the train and starting my walk, though, I heard the faint sound of what I guessed to be a car or truck door being shut behind me. I turned around, but in the darkness, I couldn't see anything. I tried to scan my surroundings once quickly. I didn't see anyone ahead of or behind me as far as my eye could see. I kept walking, this time a bit faster, and about a minute later, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around so quick I swear I could have snapped my own neck. I saw a man walking swiftly just a few feet behind me. When he saw me turn around, he began catcalling me by making kissing noises. I was used to these sorts of things, especially living in New York City. By my house, there was always a line of men on the corner every morning, waiting to be picked up for construction work. Every time I passed them to go to the store, I would get catcalled and harassed. Because of this, I simply ignored the man and kept walking. Definitely faster this time, though. Only a few seconds later, he was sprinting to catch me. He was now at my side, speaking to me in Spanish, a language which I don't speak. He grabbed my arm tightly enough to leave bruises and began pulling me towards him. I started screaming and fighting him off. He pushed me up against the cemetery fence. In the midst of this, my heart sunk to the floor. I thought I was about to be ripped or worse. Seconds later, he had me off my feet by both arms, when suddenly his face turned white in the moonlight. A look of terror passed his face as he looked past me into the cemetery, seemingly fixated on something ahead. He let out a blood-curdling scream and let me go. As I dropped to the floor, he was already sprinting across the street and running out of sight, choking on tears and shaking. Beside myself, I picked myself up and ran so fast the last few blocks to my house. I didn't dare to turn and look back into that cemetery. I didn't turn around at all. I didn't stop until I was home. I never took that train or walked past that cemetery again. To be honest, I never told my parents either. I only told a handful of friends over the years, because to this day, I still don't understand exactly what happened. All I know is that something in that cemetery probably saved my life that day. It's taken so long for me to finally be able to tell this story, because whenever I do, people seem to be underwhelmed, I guess. This was a terrifying experience for me. I can only imagine people find it to be so unbelievable it's kind of hard to sympathize with. Anyway, this was 2 years ago in the summer. I had this coworker I was friends with, and he asked me to hang out around 11 p.m. I told him I was busy and had to walk my dog. I really wasn't in the mood to hang out, but he ended up somehow convincing me anyways. So he gets to my house and we drive to this park about 10 minutes away. We sit on the swing set and talk for a while. We ended up talking about some creepy stuff, so I think we kind of spooked ourselves from the content of our conversation naturally. A bit of time later, I suggested we go to a drive-thru. We both got up to leave the park and walked to his car, which was parked on the side of the street. As we were walking, we noticed a man also walking on the sidewalk. We both mentioned to each other how we'd seen him in the park earlier as well. He creeped us out a bit since he seemed to be watching us, but we really didn't think anything else after he went away. If I remember properly, the man was walking past our car down the sidewalk. We were walking straight to get into the car. We were about 6 or so feet away from him when he turned around and started walking straight towards us. My friend hadn't even had the time to unlock his car doors before the man started screaming. "Are you fucking serious?" We had no clue why he'd be yelling at us like this, so we kinda just stood there frozen beside our car doors. I started to jiggle the passenger door and look at my friend. The man started to get closer, so we knew we had to run. I can't explain how our thought process worked in this moment, because we weren't saying anything to each other. Our instincts just kind of both kicked in after the initial shock wore off. My friend ran the same way the man had been walking before he turned around, and I ran the other way. The man chased after my friend. I kinda half jogged, half stayed in one spot, trying to figure out if my friend was about to be killed by this crazy guy or what. I screamed in their direction I was calling the police, but the guy didn't even skip a beat and kept on yelling and rambling into the night. I'm a girl and my friend was a guy, so I think naturally he wanted to get the guy away from me or something. In that moment, I thought my friend was going to be killed and the man would come back for me after. Keep in mind, we were on a street on one side of the park. There were houses all lined on this street, and not one person called the police or checked to see if we were okay. My flight kicked in, and I ran behind someone's house to hide in their backyard while I called 911. The funny part is, after explaining the situation and how we were being chased by a man saying he was going to kill us both, the 911 operator asked where I was and told me I needed to leave the backyard in case I scared the owners. I was literally hiding so I don't die, but the operator said, "Nah, go back into his line of sight so you're not hiding on someone's private property." Anyway, I heard my friend yell my name. It took me a minute to come out, but I finally did. He told me the man had run off, and the police showed up soon after. They took our statements, but didn't really seem too concerned. He put his searchlight on the cruiser and just drove around the area. Literally after the police had already left, a woman came out of her house and told us she saw the whole thing. Told me the guy was screaming he was going to rear our corpses after he killed us, and she was so scared for us. Oh, thanks. Anyway, that's my story on how we thought we were being chased by a madman who was saying he was going to rear and murder us. We thought other people would care, but nah, they just stayed inside their house and didn't even call the police for us. Please take this as advice to always watch your own back, and never expect other people to have your best interest in mind. Nobody cared about us, and we were teenagers running for our lives in a public park. People are assholes, and most of the time bystanders, making them nearly as bad as the guy that was chasing us. The police didn't seem to give much of a shit either. Private property was more important than my life. Warning: upsetting content ahead. Where to start with this story? So I work as a veterinary nurse assistant. We get unusual things brought into our clinic, but this one, I just had to share. Today, the 31st of October 2020, was my Saturday to work. I was on reception with the receptionist and vet nurse. Early 9 a.m., we get a call from an elderly man. Says he found a dead cat in his front garden at the time. Looked like its head had been caved in or something. We often get deceased animals brought in as a result of being hit by a car, so we asked him to bring it down to us. Before 10 a.m.-ish, the elderly man came in with a black cat in a plastic bag. We took contact details from the man. Then he told us about how he'd found it and how upset his wife was. Here's where things got creepy though. The cat was in a clear plastic bag. It had no head. It was decapitated. On further inspection, where the cat's head should have been were clean cuts as well. Now, a bit of a background. I live in the UK, and a while back we had a string of mutilated animals being found outside homes and in parks. At that point, the supposed suspect was called the Croydon Cat Killer, or the M25 Cat Killer. The police ruled it out to be foxes, supposedly. I've seen plenty of animals, though, that have been attacked by other animals, and I can say with absolute confidence this was no animal. The whole body, apart from the missing head, was intact. No bites, puncture wounds, broken bones, nothing to suggest the cat had been killed by an animal. It was as if it had been cut clean by a knife. We scanned the poor cat for a microchip and found one. We looked up the details on the microchip system and found the cat's name as well. Lucifer. A black cat named Lucifer found beheaded on Halloween. I wish that wasn't true and I just made it up, but sadly it was not. We tried contacting his owners. Home phone wasn't connecting, so we left a message on the mobile phone number that we'd found Lucifer and to call ASAP. Another disturbing thing was the address where Lucifer was found was 2 streets over from his registered address, and very close by my vet clinic as well. I was very wary when I finished my shift, and waited outside the clinic until my husband was outside to pick me up. It was an unnerving feeling, realizing that whoever did this was still lurking around out there. We alerted the police, RSPCA, and a group called Snarl as well, South Norwood Animal Rescue and Liberty. The lovely old man agreed to be contacted by the police and to help in any way. I've worked alongside animal cruelty and abuse cases, but this was the most chilling, disturbing, and upsetting thing I'd ever encountered. I'm hoping we get good news about this story and find out just who was behind this. This happened in the mid-60s. My family and I lived on a dead-end gravel road without any streetlights whatsoever. It must have been in the summertime, because I remember the door being wide open with only the screen door closed to let the air in. It was after dark, and the whole family was in the living room watching TV together. The whole family being both of my parents, my two other siblings, and I. My attention was soon taken away from the TV show, however, when I heard the sound of a car slowly coming down the road. Soon after, I heard a woman inside screaming the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard, either before or since. I don't think any of us decided to get up and look out the door. We just rushed there and were already looking in no time flat. The car slowly turned around and was parked facing down the road the exact way it had come. No lights on inside or out, not even the headlights. It seemed to be some sort of older model car. The woman's screaming just went on and on. My heart was pounding and I couldn't catch my breath. Finally, my mother moved first and turned on the porch light. As soon as the person in the vehicle saw the light turn on, the car started to slowly drive off down the road. The woman began to scream for help as the car continued to drive out of sight. At this point, my mother shut off the front porch light, and everyone went back to their places and sat down like nothing ever happened. No one said anything. No one did anything. I couldn't believe that my parents weren't going to do anything about this. No one ever spoke of that incident ever again. That's the creepiest thing about that night, honestly. Not the spooky car at night with the woman screaming for help, but the fact that my zombie-like parents had no reaction to that nightmare occurring in their front drive, and they didn't do anything about it either. Six years ago, I flew over the Atlantic to South Africa for my first ever safari. I've always had a fascination with Africa and the wildlife of the Serengeti, one that actually stems from being obsessed with The Lion King when I was a kid. I had that Elton John soundtrack on cassette too. I used to annoy my mom so much by belting out Circle of Life every time we drove anywhere. Over time though, that simple love for Simba and his friends evolved and matured, and soon I was researching books on Maasai culture. It got to the point where I was fixated on the idea of traveling to Africa. While my sorority sisters talked about visiting the beaches of Bali or the Bahamas after they graduated, my heart was dead set on the Serengeti. It took me a few years to be able to afford the flights, accommodation, and in-country transportation, but eventually I had a good enough job and I had enough in my bank account to be able to afford my dream trip. It was every bit as amazing as I'd imagined it would be. I spent a whole week on various jeep safaris, hanging out of a 4x4 with a pair of binoculars, and let me tell you, even at a distance, just knowing you're looking at an actual lion is a serious adrenaline rush. On one of those safaris, a nice Canadian guy mentioned how incredible an experience it was, but lamented that he couldn't get just a little bit closer to some of the wildlife. Our guide reminded us that even at 200 meters away, some of the wildlife we were admiring could close the distance in a matter of seconds. It was every bit as humbling as I expected. Like, I've never felt quite so vulnerable in all my life, even in the relatively safe confines of the various jeeps I was traveling in. That feeling was nothing, though, compared to what I felt when I decided to take a very different kind of safari. I first started properly considering an air safari after I landed in Johannesburg and began to see various commercials for them. I'd never really been interested until I spoke to someone on one of my Jeep safaris that talked about air tours like they were God's gift to naturalists. According to her, air safaris were by far the best way to observe the wildlife. She'd choose that every time if she could only afford it. Apparently, the animals don't react in quite the same way to the buzzing of an overhead aircraft as they do to a loud, clearly visible Jeep. She also mentioned that the best way to get unfettered views of the animals acting completely naturally was to do an air safari. That settled it for me. It didn't matter if it'd take a chunk out of my budget. I needed to get on that air safari to experience the exact same thing these people had. I ended up exchanging emails with a representative from one particular company. They promised me a very extensive tour at a very reasonable price. A few $1,000s later, I was meeting up with a bush pilot on this little airstrip right in the middle of nowhere. I was staring at the single-engine propeller plane we'd be flying around the Serengeti. The beat-up old thing looked like it'd be at least 20 or 30 years old. The pilot assured me, though, that she was the most reliable aircraft in their inventory, and she'd never failed him yet. I was a little bit apprehensive, but since he seemed so confident in the plane's abilities, I saw no reason to disbelieve him. After all, if he didn't think it was safe, surely he'd be the first person to refuse to fly, right? So, with that in mind, I climbed into the passenger side of the prop plane, and off we went into the skies. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. The plane flew low and slow enough for us to get some frankly incredible views of the wildlife. I was actually amazed they didn't react more to some big metal bird flying over their heads. Only the younger animals in each herd seemed to pay any attention to us. All the while, the moms continued to graze like, "Chill, we see these things all the time." Sometimes we'd fly up just a little higher, then lean into a gentle turn that allowed us to circle any herd I took an interest in, giving me a full bird's eye view. I'll admit, it was a little less personal than the Jeep safaris. Didn't quite have the same adrenaline hit, but little did I know I was about to get a lifetime's worth of adrenaline in just a few minutes. After 20 minutes into the flight, we were circling over a herd of elephants with the steady drone of the plane's engine buzzing in our ears. And then suddenly, the buzzing stopped altogether. It didn't just stop dead either. It was a stuttering, rattling sound as the engine tried to keep itself going for a moment and then just gave out altogether. I looked over at the pilot completely baffled, but he waved away my concerns while thumbing the plane's ignition, making out like it happened all the time and this was nothing to worry about. I've stalled my car in traffic before, so I figured what we were going through was the aviation equivalent of just that or something. Irritating at best, scary at worst, but still nothing to actually worry about. Yet as I was waiting for the plane's engine to whir back into life from the pilot's repeated attempts to restart it, it started to dawn on me that this wasn't some run-of-the-mill mechanical problem. The engine had completely died and was not coming back to life. That horrifying fact became obvious once the pilot stopped trying to restart the engine. I don't even know how I managed to avoid a complete mental breakdown. The pilot turned to me and said, "We're gonna have to land. We're going to crash." I remember wanting to ask him if we were going to die, but the words wouldn't leave my mouth. I stayed quiet as the pilot walked me through what we would need to do. "It's gonna be fine, don't worry. But this is gonna be a bit of a bumpy landing, okay?" I couldn't say it at the time, but I was convinced this would be the end. When I realized that, a weird feeling of calm came over me. It was like there was no point worrying about something I was doomed to face. We were going down, and there was nothing I could do about it other than brace for impact. The only thing I could think as we began to drop altitude was hoping the end would be quick and we wouldn't have to burn to death before vultures devoured us or something. At 200 feet, I was concentrating on my breathing, trying to keep calm as the trees and foliage grew bigger and bigger at a fast rate. At 100 feet, I began shaking, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. It was less nervous shaking and more terrified full-body vibration. I turned to the pilot to say something, and I remember him just saying, Shut up and let me think, woman! It was the kind of comment that would have me clapping back in a normal situation, but in this dead-engine prop plane, I decided to just take it at the chin. At 50 feet, the pilot screamed to hold on. The plane's nose tilted down slightly, and he began to bring us in for the emergency landing. I just remember gripping onto this little handle so tightly. I couldn't bear to watch, so I shut my eyes and hoped for the best. Wham! We hit the dirt hard, but instead of rolling over and crashing, I could feel the landing gear of the plane rumbling against the earth. The plane was shaking like a leaf, and I was convinced it was about to shatter apart. I could hear the pilot shouting, come on, you can do it!" as he talked to the plane. Then, out of nowhere, he started whooping and hollering in celebration. It didn't feel like we were safe, but evidently we were no longer going to explode into a ball of flame or something. When we finally came to a shaky stop, the pilot started laughing maniacally, kissing the dash of the plane. "I told you she hadn't let me down yet." I was in complete shock. I was still shaking, but I turned to the pilot, high-fiving him and telling him he was the man. It was the most intense feeling of my entire life, and one I'll never forget. We were pretty banged up. I had some bruises, but we were otherwise okay. We weren't quite out of trouble yet, though. Once the euphoria died down, we realized we were stranded in the middle of the Serengeti, and our crash had attracted an awful lot of attention. Most animals would have run a mile to get away from the big metal bird that came falling out of the sky, but not all of them. Some of them were attracted to the chaos and destruction, and it led to my closest encounter with any animal in all of Africa. We were quite easily able to relay our coordinates to the rescue team, and the pilot had a few flares he could use to throw on the ground if it got dark. It wasn't like we were going to be stuck there for eternity, but even the 90 minutes we had to wait seemed like forever. We were totally exposed to all the wildlife surrounding us. We got kind of lucky in the end, I think, but we still had a rather close encounter that scared the life out of me. When you think of the scariest animals in Africa, what do you think? Lions, hippos, snakes, spiders? I doubt many people's first answer would be hyenas, but you can bet your butt that was my answer, after a pack of them wandered within just 50 feet and started to surround us. People say they laugh, right? The sound that they make is kind of like a person laughing. Let me tell you, once you hear that sound with your own ears, it sounds nothing like laughter. I remember jumping back in the cockpit of the crashed plane. The pilot was taking a nap, but woke up to show me the pistol we kept in the same place as the flares. "If they come any closer, give them a fright, all right?" I tried to relax, but it was hard with a gang of baying hyenas a few feet away. If there ever was a clear sign that bush pilot was completely insane, it was this. I still owed him my life, though, so I didn't say squat to him. Not long after, I heard the distinct sound of an engine in the distance, and the plane's radio buzzed to life. The rescue team, having driven as fast as they could for 100 miles to reach us. I'd never been so happy to see another human being in my whole life. They drove us back to civilization, and I ate the best meal I've ever had, with the pilot at a little roadside diner. He asked for 2 orders of bunny chow, which turned out to be an entire loaf of bread stuffed with curry. As it turned out, that and several beers are exactly what a person needs after surviving a plane crash in the middle of Africa. I have kind of a weird story to tell. I've only ever told one person, as honestly, I didn't realize how strange the entire situation was until I brought this up to a friend of mine. This happened a few months ago, and at the time, I had just recently been fired from my job. I had been working there for several years, and so the abrupt firing caught me by surprise. I thought everything had been going all right for me, but just like that, they told me to pack up my things and leave right away. Honestly, it made me feel pretty bad. Rather than spend some time trying to find another job immediately, I spent a few weeks moping around my house and not doing much of anything. I had lost both the strength and the will to do anything, especially look for a new job. Though at that dark point in my life, one of my close friends tried to help me out. This friend reached out, telling me that a position at one of her other friends' companies had opened up recently. It was nearly the same as the one I'd been fired from, so right away it seemed I'd hit the jackpot. All seemed perfect, though there was still something in my mind saying this was a little bit strange. My friend, who I won't name for privacy's sake, had always been a little bit on the shady side. Maybe they just weren't the most open person to talk to, or maybe they were just simply reserved, but there always seemed to be something a little bit off about them. For the sake of my future, as well as a potential job opportunity though, I put that out of my mind and focused on applying. In just a short time, I'd gotten out of my slump pretty fast and was preparing for this new job and a new start as well. My friend sent me the phone number of the company and told me the hours I would be able to call them at. I woke up as early as possible on the day I was going to give them a call, readying myself for the always nerve-wracking interview I was about to have. When the time was right, I called the company, and before I knew it, I was connected to your average phone-answering secretary, it seemed. The fake peppy voice she put on made me feel that I'd had the right number straight away, and I told her the reason I was calling. She was quick to begin asking questions afterward, taking in all my basic information. Name, phone number, just like every other company did as standard procedure. I replied with all the information she was seeking, along with answering a few more filtering personal questions she asked, like what experience I had and any prior jobs I'd had as well. I sat on the call for some time answering her questions before she said she'd gotten all the information she needed out of me. At the end of the call, she informed me that 2 days from then, I could come in for an in-person interview. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting still for a few moments after. I was as happy as I could be. After going through such a tough time unexpectedly, it felt like I was really getting somewhere. It was easy to say I was ecstatic about getting an interview. Thus, I spent the next few days preparing before the day was finally here. I woke up early, got dressed in my finest. A black suit over a button-up shirt underneath, along with a pair of fine dress pants. I went the full 9 yards with everything that morning, as I knew I had to be my best for any interview. I pepped myself up the entire time as well, until I was finally ready to leave. Still though, I was really nervous. I took a few deep breaths before leaving the house. I got into my car and started heading to the address. I remember the drive actually wasn't too far away, only about 10 minutes or so. As I got closer though, it began to feel as if my destination was hours away. I got closer to the address, and my nerves got even worse. I had been through many interviews before, and the thought of one more shouldn't have made me as nervous as I was. It got the best of me during the car drive, and I was completely caught up in them. Before I even realized I'd pulled right into a parking space of where my GPS had told me to go. As I parked, I came to my senses and realized where I was. I managed to get even more nervous as I realized this. I wanted to go home and forget about this interview, as I thought about how unexpectedly my last job had ended. Still though, I shook him off and looked at where my GPS had taken me. I stepped out and looked at the building in front of me. Instead of what I assumed was going to be a typical office space or something, there was a gigantic run-down building in front of me. I remember staring at every inch for some time. All the windows were either broken or boarded up completely. The coloring of the bricks was faded as well, and there wasn't even a front door on the place. I began to think that I simply had the wrong address, but my GPS confirmed this seemed to be the correct destination. I even checked the address I'd typed in multiple times. Each time I looked, the numbers were the same and correct. I realized that this really seemed to be the right place. My mind was all over the place in this moment. My nerves about the interview were gone, although in their place was a whole new set of anxiousness. I went closer to the building to inspect it. I had to see for myself that the building was the right one before I decided to leave. As I approached, I was stopped by someone coming out from the side of the building, a man in a reflective high-visibility jacket. "Hey, what are you doing here? This is a construction zone," the man yelled. I was even more confused. I understood what he meant though when I walked closer to him and caught a peek around the other side. There was indeed a construction crew with tons of heavy machinery just sitting there. "Oh, sorry, I thought this was the place for my interview. I was looking for so-and-so, but it seems I have the wrong place." No, this is so-and-so, but I don't know what interview you're going to be having here. The building's been abandoned for a few decades," the man said. My face turned to shock, and I got even more of a headache from the situation. "But I called a few days ago," someone answered and said she was with a company called so-and-so. The man stared at me. "I don't know who's trying to fool you here, but this building did belong to that company back in the day. They haven't been around for a few decades, though. Now get along there. The building's supposed to be demolished today, and my guys have to get back to work," the man said again. I could do nothing but leave. The company seemingly didn't exist anymore. It seemed like I'd been the victim of some sort of cruel prank at the hand of whoever was on the other line. But something put me off. The call had seemed so legitimate. The girl on the other line had certainly fooled me for being a secretary of some company. I didn't think much more of it, though. The man had said the company I was trying to join hadn't existed in that place in decades. Just like that, I was back to square one. No job and no interview. The drive back home was long and silent. It hardly even fazed me just how weird the encounter had been, as all I could think about was now I wasn't even able to have that much to be excited about. I got home and went right back to where I'd started. I holed up in my house for a couple of weeks, not having the motivation to do anything, as I once again found myself in a depressive episode. As more time went by, I slowly healed again, and found the will to look for a job once more. This was several months ago, mind you, and since then I fixed myself even more. I was able to find a new job, much better for my own health than the one I'd been fired from. Over the several months in between this story I just told and now, I'd been so focused on my new job and working hard enough to keep it, that the situation had gone through and slipped my mind entirely. It wasn't up until the point that I told my friend the entire story of what happened to me that I realized just how strange it was. When I informed my friend the number they had given me, I realized it was actually incorrect from the one she'd meant to give me. She apologized a lot after realizing her mistake and ended up giving me the actual phone number, which is actually how I found my current job. The fact of what I had gone through was still up for question. I had accidentally been given a wrong number, but was put through to a seemingly real company. On top of that, I even got told to come in for an interview to a real address, and for a real company that once existed, even if it no longer did. The whole situation is just kind of a big mystery to me. My friend and I threw out many ideas, some that were pretty ordinary like a simple prank call, and some that were farther out. You know, some like how I could have gone through an insane phenomenon like time travel through a phone call or something. Some of the ideas were of course ridiculous, and even now I have no clue what happened to me on that day. Somewhere on the wind-blown plains of Middle America, there stands a home. It's a regular, unassuming home. Nothing in its appearance draws your attention, nor marks it out as any different from the others. But this home once held a dark secret, one that would remain hidden for the most part. At least until today. You see, once upon a time, not all that long ago actually, this was my home. I was among a small number of young men. We resided in the dark depths of the home's basement, 5 in total. We existed there not by choice, but by decree. Our days were consumed with work, while our nights were spent in dreaming. Among those dreams, we often entertained the idea of freedom. Fortunately for myself and the others, one brave member of our community would make these dreams a reality. She's the reason I'm able to share my story with you today. I suppose I'll start with the larger aspects of the tale before focusing on myself. Of course, no real names or locations will be used for the sake of privacy. It all began way before I was actually born, around the mid-1960s or so. A young charismatic preacher built a dedicated group around him. His theology was different from most in the faith. According to his teachings, Mary Magdalene was given the power to speak the word of God by Jesus himself. Upon his ascent to heaven, Mary effectively became the head of the Christian Church. Through generations, this line was passed down into our Holy Father, who traced himself back to Mary Magdalene herself. This idea was surprisingly well received at the time. By 1980, they'd amassed a congregation of over 3,500. However, as times changed, more and more devotees left the church for a number of different reasons. When I was born in 1993, our group had dwindled to a paltry 125 members. A few years earlier, this church had purchased a small piece of land in the upper area of the Midwest. All the buildings were built by hand by the congregation. Everyone was required to live on this compound, and all labor was evenly divided amongst the members. It was very similar to the communes popular in the 1960s and 70s. I can only assume our church was built around the same model. I'm leaving out quite a bit, but I just wanted to give you the general idea. The community was very similar to the agrarian lifestyles of centuries past, and most all work was done by hand. It wasn't like in my time machines were shunned or anything. Many people just took pride in doing them on their own, no matter the hardship. That was the type of environment I grew up in. I'll take a few moments to explain what led to us living in a basement. From the start, females enjoyed an exalted position in our particular faith. They served as apostles and teachers to the young and newer members. Other than our leader himself, no other man held any position of power. This was just an accepted part of life, really, and rarely ever questioned. A male had to be married to even remain in or join the congregation. In later years, our leader even put a severe restriction on new marriages. Therefore, the younger men unable to find a partner or simply uninterested in marrying would be excommunicated after reaching the age of 21. Nearing the end of that time, we became little more than beasts of burden, strong hands for the fields and other things. The biggest change, though, came in 1998. The Holy Father decreed that all males must be sent to live in the youth dorm at the time of puberty. For propriety's sake, this was a basement that he'd termed the youth dorm. But we all knew it was just a regular old musty, mold-filled basement. This pronouncement only served to further fracture our already ailing group. Unfortunately for me, though, my parents were true diehards. We remained along with the very last of the devotees, so when my time came at 13 years old, I couldn't do anything. I had to take my place in the basement. Although the adjustment period was very difficult, a strong bond soon formed with my fellow prisoners, at least as I put it. From dawn till dusk, we were worked ragged, our only respite coming on Sundays, in which we spent the mornings in holy services. The remainder of the day was our own. However, those that didn't volunteer to do additional work were required to remain locked in the basement. While far more terrible things would be suffered by us during our time there, I'm still unfortunately unable to discuss them. I think it's better they stay buried, honestly. Out of nowhere, in 2010, an unlikely individual would change everything, though. Ruth was just another congregant, but by advantage of being born a woman in our group, she held a leadership position. Although not lofty by any means, it was a substantial amount of power due to the dwindling group at our time. Unknown to anyone else inside the group, she'd been building a body of information implicating our Holy Father in multiple crimes. On several visits into town, she met up with law enforcement and their colleagues in the district attorney's office. They seemed especially interested in the treatment of males in the church. Luckily, he'd also been cheating on his taxes as well, the crime he was ultimately imprisoned for. When the day came that Ruth turned over all the documents to authorities, that church ceased to exist. A judge ruled our treatment to be inhumane and immoral, and we left the basement for the final time later that week. Everything else was handled quietly behind closed doors, as to prevent embarrassment to the local community. When I was finally able to speak to Ruth face to face, I asked her why she'd done it. She said our treatment within the congregation had always bothered her father's in particular. Just a year prior, she had begun a secret relationship with one of the young men locked in the basement. She knew they would likely not be allowed to marry as long as things continued as they did. The last straw was what she discovered while digging, though. The extent of the Holy Father's corruption sickened her. Her initial intent had not been to destroy our group, but she realized he was inextricably woven into it. I greatly admired her, and any person willing to sacrifice everything for those they love. She managed to build a respectable and happy life outside the church. My wife and I named our first daughter Ruth as a sign of respect for her. To close things out, I want to share the fate of my fellow dorm mates as well. It seems that our horrible experiences did not have any noticeable long-term side effects. All of us are now married with families. Mark, my closest friend from the church, has been with his partner for quite some time after. It's a story with many dark aspects, and I'd like to end it with a positive message. I know many of us have suffered terrible things in our lives. A great deal of us may still be suffering. Rather than my story being one of sadness, though, I prefer to view it as one of hope. I want you to make note of this. No matter how dark things may seem at the moment, better things may be waiting just around the corner. Back in 2004, my wife and I decided we couldn't face freezing our bits off for yet another British winter and started looking for a much more tropical location to spend that festive period. We were working on a bit of a budget and couldn't quite afford the Thai or Vietnamese beaches we'd had our hearts set on, but after a bit of searching, we came across this lovely little beachside bed and breakfast in a little town called Galle, on the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka. It was definitely priced as a budget hotel, but the photos the owners had taken showed it to be a quaint, clean, and beautiful little place. Once my wife was taken with it, I had very little choice on the matter anyway, so I made us a booking. The food was amazing, the people were welcoming, and the beaches were everything we could have hoped for. Come Christmas Day, we had the most unusual Christmas dinner of our lives, sharing a veritable banquet of different dolls and curries at a local restaurant. It was so good that neither of us missed the pigs and blankets that year. I'm sure most of you will agree that's really saying something. We finished off with a few drinks on the beach, stopping every so often to giggle at how surreal it all was that we were here sunbathing on Christmas Day. Then, once we were drowsy enough, we headed off to bed for an early night. The next morning was even better. No hangovers, no dodgy leftovers to work through, no going down to the local park in the freezing cold to pretend that a brisk Boxing Day walk is anything but absolute balls. Just sun, sea, and sandy beaches for 5 more days. Me and the wife replaced the horrid Boxing Day park walk with drinks and nibbles in a beachside cafe. Nibbling on dips and wondering how we were going to readjust to life back in the UK again. I mean, it had been literally paradise for almost a full fortnight. We could have never probably guessed in that moment that our festive little Asian trip would turn out to be the biggest mistake of our lives. We soon learned that any dream day can turn into a living nightmare in a matter of minutes. So we're just sitting there in this open-air restaurant, holding hands, enjoying the lovely rhythmic sound of the waves gently breaking against the beach. When suddenly, it stopped. We heard a big rush of water as the water was pulled back away from the shore, but no crash followed. Me and my wife watched as the water crept further and further back away from the shore. And I don't mean like a few feet or something. It kept going and going until we could barely even see the edge anymore. There was only wet sand as far as the eye could see. I distinctly remember the moment I saw these tiny specks on the wet sand in the distance, and how it almost looked like they were jumping up and down. And then I realized that's exactly what they were doing. These were fish that had been swimming in the shallows when the water had just disappeared. Now they were flapping around in the sand and gasping for breath. I turned to see the young waitress standing behind us. I asked her what was happening, but her face told me all I needed to know. She was gawking even harder than we were, and had obviously never seen anything like this in her life. Next thing I know, there were people sprinting out onto the wet sand with plastic bags, scooping up the fish into them before moving on to the next poor flounder or whatever. It was actually quite amusing for a moment, thinking it must have been the easiest morning's fishing any of them had ever experienced. But in the next moment, I heard this absolute roar of a shout coming from down on the beach. An older man was screaming something to the lads out scooping up fish. He turned and started shouting with his hands cupped around his mouth, like he was trying to announce something serious to everyone. I turned to the waitress to ask her what he was saying, but by that time her dad had showed up and had this horrified look on his face. I could tell he was looking out to the sea, so I turned to see just what it was he was looking at. That's when I saw the water was starting to come back, only it wasn't returning as gently as it had gone away. It was getting faster and faster, the wave getting bigger and bigger. "Sir, ma'am, come upstairs right now," I remember the owner saying very suddenly. "There's a big wave coming. We have to get upstairs now." The cafe was basically a big hollowed-out concrete block, so I was confident we would indeed be safe if we went upstairs where there was another open-air dining area. The only trouble was getting everyone up there. The owner's elderly mother was confined to a wheelchair. I didn't actually see her at first. She was in another room when we all started to move. I was halfway up the stairs already by the time I saw the owner desperately trying to pull her up from the bottom. It was one of the most horrifying moments of my life. I could see the man trying to pull her up the stairs backwards in the wheelchair, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to do it on his own. I basically pushed my wife up the stairs, then forced my way back down towards where the owner was struggling. I grabbed one handle and he grabbed the other, but that wasn't working either. We actually tried to carry the whole thing by grabbing the wheel spokes, but that still wasn't working. The whole time I could hear the wave getting closer and closer. I could hear my wife from the top floor screaming, "Oh my God," as it was getting nearer to the building. Then it struck. We didn't have the owner's mom up as high as we needed. All this water and debris came crashing over us. It was pure chaos for a second. I grabbed onto the banister. All of a sudden, the water level dropped a bit, but it was still rushing past us. This let me see that I'd gotten a hold of the owner's arm, while he had a hold of his mom's hands. The wheelchair had been swept away. It was there one moment, and gone the next. Dragged away by what turned out to be a 15-foot-high tsunami. I'm sorry if this writing takes a turn at this point. Remembering it is really painful, and I'm sure you'll understand why in a moment. I was pulling up with all my might, trying to keep the owner and by proxy his mom from being washed away. They were too heavy for me to drag out of the water, and I was struggling to hold on myself. I was terrified I was going to lose my grip, which would mean not only would I die, but they would die too. I can't even express how ashamed I am to say this, but there was a moment I thought about just letting go. The kind of terror I felt in that moment, I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. It was like something else just took over, a screw everyone but me kind of attitude that placed my life above all else. But even in that moment, I knew I couldn't let go. If I lost grip on them, if they got ripped away from me, that was different. But for me to let go seemed like murder for me to go through with it. The next thing I knew, I was snapped out of that horrible moment by screaming from the owner and his mom. I didn't have a clue what they were saying. I'm choking up as I'm writing this. The owner suddenly let go of his mom's hand. I thought she might have slipped or something, but the way he turned so purposefully and ran back up the stairs, I knew he'd just let her go. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do, so I followed him up the stairs to the safety of the top floor. I felt my wife hug me before she burst into tears. It hadn't occurred to me, but because she hadn't been able to see what I was doing, she thought I'd been washed away the whole time. She was crying and screaming at me. I swear I wanted to tell her what just happened, but I just couldn't. Instead, I looked over the edge of the open-top dining area and gasped at the utter destruction below us. The entire landscape had been transformed, almost unrecognizable. The water kept going and going inland, never slowing down and never stopping. I remember the moment I realized it could have been happening to the entire island. Miles and miles of coastline, completely and utterly destroyed in a few moments. Yet although it was bad enough when the water was coming in, it was even worse when the tide dragged it back out again. All that death and destruction that was caused bulldozing its way inland was pulled back past us as the wave returned to the ocean. I saw so many bodies I lost count. Every other second I saw a patch of pink or brown floating on the surface, a streak of color from someone's clothing. So many dead people, so many who didn't see it coming. But the hardest part for me to bear was yet to come. When the majority of the danger had passed by, there was just stagnant water on the floor below us. The owner and one of his sons ventured downstairs to bring up what little food and water they could salvage from the kitchen. We knew the rescue wouldn't be quick, and the people were already working their way through the mess outside, pulling out dead bodies and survivors alike. Me and my wife pitched in as best as we could, but the fact remained there just wasn't much we could do, other than try to comfort the handful of people with us. That night, none of us could sleep, even with the free beer that the owner had given us. So when I saw him smoking a cigarette in the darkness all on his own, I thought I should give him a bit of company. I hadn't smoked since I first tried in college, but that night I asked him for a cigarette. Out of nowhere, he said to me, "I didn't want to let her go." I didn't even really know what to say. I knew he was referring to his mom, but I didn't know if he was just trying to rationalize or what, so I nodded. He went on to tell me that his mom had told him to let her go. She knew I wasn't strong enough to pull them both in, and she also knew it wouldn't be long before we'd all be dragged off. So she sacrificed herself for us. The owner told me their little exchange went something like this. "Let me go." "No, you'll drown. If you don't let me go, we'll all die." "Son, I've had a long life, and I've had a good life. You've been a good son, and you've made me very proud. But your family, you need to take care of them, so do as I tell you." He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye, so he just let her go, then turned and went to look after his family, just like his mom had told him to. This all happened 16 years ago, and I still can't talk or think about it without tearing up every time. I can't even imagine being in that position. Just knowing it happened was completely traumatizing. Only God knows how the man dealt with it himself. I think that's why this has been so helpful to type up. I can't really talk to anyone about what happened that day, besides my wife, anyway. They either get frustrated or they don't understand. If they ask too many questions, I start thinking about the owner's mom again. I choke up and then there's no more talking at all. I think to an extent, the trauma just kind of becomes part of you. It doesn't hurt anyone, it's not debilitating, but it's always there, like the scar left behind after a deep wound. When the headline screamed "Local man tortured in basement," I was naturally curious. Little did I know that I would be in the same position not even a week later. According to the story in the paper, a group of home invaders had burst into a nearby jewel dealer's home to steal a stash of diamonds he was rumored to have on site. Having caught the dealer unawares, they demanded to know the location of said stash. The dealer, as it would turn out, truthfully told the gang that no such thing existed. The only thing he did have was an empty safe in his bedroom closet. Of course, this revelation did not make the group very happy. They chose to disbelieve the homeowner, and for the next hour or so, the burglars took turns torturing him for the location of this non-existent stash. It would only be the arrival of a nosy neighbor that would cause the thieves to scatter, but by this point, the homeowner was mere minutes away from death had he not been so swiftly rushed to the hospital. A harrowing story to be sure, but never once had I ever thought that I would have anything to do with it. The extent of my riches amassed was only about 25 grand or so. It consisted of a 19th century gold and silver coin collection my father had left me. I just had the collection appraised the year before, probably why I was chosen as a target. The appraiser at the time had offered me $10,000 for it, but I politely declined. The coins sat collecting dust in my floor-side safe. After that week or more went by, I was loafing on my couch watching a movie, about 2 p.m. on a Saturday, I believe, when suddenly a loud crashing came from my front door. I was so focused on the television in that moment, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I peeked around the corner just in time to see 3 masked figures pouring in one by one through my recently shattered door. They were surrounding me, guns raised. Within a few seconds, I was told to get down on my knees, and naturally I did so. My heart was pounding, and my mouth was bone dry. Instead of shooting me though, one of them demanded I give him the combination to my safe. This was the moment I realized who I was dealing with. I tried to play dumb. "There's no safe. Do I look like a guy that would have a safe?" I said. I know my ability to lie is usually better, but I wasn't exactly prepared for the situation. The shortest of the group gave me a quick attitude correction with the barrel of his pistol. Still, I could not tell. My pride and love for my father prevented me from doing so. I wouldn't be caught dead letting some thugs steal his life's work. Had I been more clear-headed and given more time to think things over, perhaps I would have chosen a wiser path. To their credit, I was given plenty of opportunity to concede, but once they had me tied up in the basement, they were all business. Even as they tightened the knots and applied the gag, I was convinced it was simply a fear tactic. Surely after what had happened before, they wouldn't repeat the same mistake. But by God was I wrong. Right out the gate, one of them smashed my left hand with a hammer. The pain was unimaginable. My right hand was next. It was even worse, if that's possible. I was ready to tell them anything at that point, but I'd angered them, and they simply wanted to make me pay for that. My feet were next, then my knees. I was barely even conscious. Only then was I permitted to speak. While one guy went upstairs, the remaining 2 huddled in the corner talking. I could imagine my fate was being discussed. I never saw their faces. There was no reason to add murder to their list of crimes, I thought. I knew this instinctively, but I was convinced I'd not live to see the morning. The next few hours were hazy. All the adrenaline had worn off, and the pain was coming in waves so severe I passed out more than once. In the moment, it seemed death would have been more preferable, but due to some fortune, I stayed alive. I can't exactly tell you when that gang left. I wouldn't have known how long I spent tied up had my son not told me so later. Yes, my son's stubbornness was my savior. After multiple unanswered calls, he began to believe I was dodging him. The young man drove 45 miles one way just to give me an earful. I thought I was dreaming. His voice echoed down the basement stairs, and I thought I was having a death hallucination. The paramedics moving me finally woke me up, though. For a split second, I actually believed them to be my captors. Their faces were bare, so I was sure death was coming, but my son calmly placed his hands on my shoulders and assured me everything was all right. It's probably clear what followed next. My time in the hospital extended a long period with multiple surgeries, and the recovery after was spent in various casts, even a period of time in a wheelchair. For the most part, I managed to completely heal. The cold and damp are a chore now, but since I moved south, I rarely experienced that sort of pain. As sad as this may sound, I harbor no lasting hatred of those thieves. They may have taken something valuable, but they gave me a much more important thing back, my life and my relationship with my son. Nonetheless, when I was notified of their arrest 7 months later, I was overjoyed. Only a small amount of the collection was reclaimed, most being sold long ago. Honestly, I was surprised to get any of it back at all. Presently, all of these gentlemen are a guest of the correctional system, likely for the next 30 years or more. I briefly returned to work after my recovery, but I subsequently had to retire soon after. The majority of my days are now spent in leisurely pursuits, like fishing and hunting. I learned an important lesson in that moment all those years ago. Life is a special and fleeting thing, and you should enjoy every day like it's your last. I'd gladly sacrifice 1 million coin collections for another day with those I love. This happened to me just a few weeks ago. I've dwelled on telling this story to anyone that wasn't close to me over that time, and now I believe that I'm doing well enough to come out about what happened. I, 24 and female, have been living on my own for several years now. I settled into my own house shortly after finishing college. I hadn't had any major problems with the house so far, and everything seemed to be great all around. On top of that, the neighborhood I settled into was amazing as well. All my neighbors were very lovely, and I was able to interact with all of them and become somewhat close. It seemed like I had found a place I could live in forever. There wasn't a single problem in sight, at least until one of my neighbors that I had grown close to over the time I'd spent in that house moved away one day. At first, my neighbor leaving was nothing more than an unfortunate life event. Sure, I would miss them, but there wasn't much I could do about it, and it wasn't as if something horrific had happened to them and I'd never hear from them again. Them leaving, though, was just the start of the problem, as what was brought in their vacancy was far worse than I could have ever suspected. When my neighbor found a home elsewhere, they had put their house up for sale, and over the coming weeks, many people came and went in and out of the house. First off were the movers, removing everything that my neighbors had told them to before putting them up in their new home. Once everything was out, it was time to sell off the house, which brought in people that were looking to move. Tons of people were moving in and out daily, as it seemed like the area I had moved into was quite the hot commodity. I watched as families, couples, and even rich singles walked in and out of the house every day. Cars lined the street as the same female realtor walked them all through the house one by one. This went on for quite some time. I would go to work when the people began to pour in and look around, and when I came back, around the time when it finished up, the last groups were just getting done with their tours. One particular day I came home, and just like any other, people were getting in their cars and leaving as the street cleared out for the day. As I walked up to my front door, though, I realized that the realtor and a viewer were having a conversation on the front lawn. I let them be as they talked, until I noticed that both of their gazes were now fixated upon me. I looked back at them as they waved over to me. Like any normal person would, I gave a polite wave back before going back inside my house. I really didn't think that much about it at the time, but the viewer that I had waved to was a little bit unsettling to look at. Something about them just set me off slightly. I didn't really give it much mind though, especially since I figured I would never see them again. Hundreds of people had viewed the house, and chances of him buying it seemed slim to me. With this thought in my head, I went about my night before going to bed. When I woke up the next morning though, something was different. As I prepared to leave for work, there was no bustle of cars outside the house next door. No group after group going inside and looking around. There was silence. It was nice, but that silence meant something. The house had been sold off, as there was now a sold sticker over the sign on the front lawn. That wasn't much for me to think about for the time being, other than wondering who my new neighbors were going to be. I at least hoped they were going to be up to the standard of my last ones. I went to work, and at the end of the day when I came back home, I had my very first encounter with my new neighbor. I walked inside, enjoying the silence of the house next door. I sat down at my kitchen table, grabbing something to eat from my fridge. When I sat down, I looked over at that house next door and saw someone inside. They were surveying the room they were in before they glanced out their window. I remember the piercing glare they hit me with as the eyes of the man from the other day met my own. Even though he was glaring at me, somehow the look on his face still managed to be quite friendly, and thus I gave a forced smile and a slight wave. I was shocked to see that man from before inside the house now, but that only meant one thing. My new neighbor was him. It made me feel a little bit strange, honestly, but maybe that was just the impression I was getting from him. Didn't want to judge a book by its cover. Besides, he seemed to be really nice. That's what I told myself in my head at least, as I tried to get that original strange encounter with him out of my mind. Little did I know I would be seeing his gaze a lot more after that first encounter with him, partly because he was going to move in very shortly thereafter. After that day, he was at his new house daily, moving in his stuff with the help of movers and other workers. I went about the next week as if it was any other, with the only difference being that instead of people coming to view the house and it being noisy, there was a man next door moving in being noisy at all hours of the day. On top of that, he always seemed to be gazing at me, his eyes always tracking mine. Each time he would give a friendly wave before going on about his day and continuing what he was doing, as if it had never happened. This went on until just about a week and a half after he had bought the house, as he'd fully moved into it now. I tried to tell myself the man was very friendly, but something about him still put me on edge when I was around him. With nothing else to do, I would welcome him to the neighborhood and go over to his house myself with a small gift. It was a good thing to do as a neighbor in the first place. Without a real plan, I went over next door and introduced myself, as well as scoped out the person I had so many suspicions about. In all honesty, it went perfectly fine. He graciously accepted my gift and introduced himself kindly as my new neighbor. I introduced myself right back. It was such a pleasant, normal interaction that I immediately wrote off all my suspicions of him being anything other than a completely normal guy. Maybe I'd actually be able to get along with him as well as my last neighbors. He didn't seem like someone I'd have to be wary of, at the very least. After introducing myself, the days between us went on even more normally. I saw him a few times. I saw him very little actually, aside from sometimes when I came or left from work. Even then, all we'd do was wave, say hi, and casually chat for a bit. I slowly saw a change, however, as I began to see my neighbor more and more frequently. It started with him being outside when I came home more and more, to the point where it was almost daily. It wasn't that out of place, I guess, but it still stuck in the back of my mind. Then it turned into seeing him before I left almost every day as well. It didn't stop there either. I began to see him out my window in the early mornings. I would catch him facing the direction of my house before he cracked his signature friendly smile. It got progressively worse too. I began to see him staring at me out the window more and more. I got more and more creeped out until one event finally broke me. I came home from work one evening, and to my surprise, he was not out in front of his house waiting to wave at me like always. I went inside and decided to do a few things before heading to bed. Ate, watched some TV, waited for a few hours to pass before I felt tired enough to hit the hay. Not before I took my dog out for its nightly walk though. The weather was just starting to get nicer, and I had been regularly walking him around the neighborhood for about 15 minutes or so each night. It was a nice routine. I grabbed up his leash and the two of us stepped outside. There was a little excitement on these walks, as usually everyone was in bed around the time we went out. It was much nicer this way. The silence of the night was something I greatly enjoyed, even if it was only for 15 minutes a day. Eventually, our walk came to an end as we rounded the corner that led back to my house. I remember looking into the house next to mine as I walked past. My neighbor always seemed to be asleep at this time of night, as there were no lights on inside of his house. That stayed the same today, though even with no lights on, I still felt something from the house, as if my neighbor was staring at me somehow, even though all his windows were closed with the curtains drawn in front of them, and there was no visible light inside. I could still feel his piercing gaze. I tried to push that feeling out of my mind. I looked toward my own house and picked up the pace slightly. Eventually, I made it inside. I shut the door behind me in a hurry as I leaned my back against it, staying still for a few moments while recovering myself. I remember panicking hard, having to catch my breath. I quickly did and went on to try and get some sleep. I got all ready for bed, but was stopped in my tracks when I entered my bedroom to finally lay down. Across the way from my room, and my neighbor's window, he was standing there, staring into my room as I got ready to lay down. He smiled and waved at me like he always did. I remember panicking and running out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I wasted no time running to each other door and making sure they were already locked. I shut every blind and curtain I had on my windows and completely sealed myself in. I wanted to sleep, but fear kept me awake, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. Eventually, the sun shone through the cracks in the blinds, and I could tell it was now morning. The subtle light in the room made me feel a bit safer, although I knew I was not out of the woods yet. With the sunlight creeping in, I calmed myself down. I was composed enough to tell someone what happened. I messaged a group chat with my closest friends and let them know what was going on. A few of them offered to come over immediately or even call the police for me, though I had no actual evidence my neighbor was doing anything of ill intent. Thus, I took one of my friends up on their offer to stay over. He was one of my closest guy friends, and the person I probably trusted most to help me out in this situation. He said he was coming over soon. I spent the time waiting for him to come over by calling my work and letting them know what was going on, and I would be taking the day off that day. A little time passed before I could hear my friend's car outside as he pulled into my driveway. A knock at the front door followed as I went to open it. I made sure the person I was letting in was my friend. I felt some stress lifted off my shoulders as I let him in. We sat down on my couch as I sprawled out on it before passing out almost instantly. The comfort I felt from having someone around made me fall asleep right away, and I was finally able to put my worries out of my mind. I woke late into the night as I got my usual amount of rest and then some. I woke up completely disoriented as well, almost unable to tell where I was. It was one of the best rests I'd had in a while. It was around 8 p.m. when I woke up. My friend told me when I had gotten more oriented, and I thanked him for staying with me while I slept. He wanted to stay for the rest of the night. I took him off on his offer, though I wasn't that tired whatsoever. We stayed up together and watched TV. This went on around an hour or so, before it was time for my nightly walk with the dog. Usually I would get ready to go right away, but tonight I was second-guessing myself on if I should or not. Ultimately, I went against it, much to the dismay of my dog, who didn't seem to be very happy. It was for the best, though. With nothing else to do except go back to watching TV, we did just that. My dog didn't seem to want to sit still, though. He kept on pacing around the house. My dog went on to do this for about 20 minutes, until he started whining repeatedly. It started out quietly at first, but soon picked up until the point where we could no longer ignore him. I went to check on what my dog was whining about. I found him pacing around a room near a window wall, one that he could see out of, as he seemed to direct me toward the window. I got closer, as he began to bark louder and louder. I almost yelled at him for barking so late at night, before I realized the reason he'd been going off the whole time. I crept up towards him, picked him up in my arms, and then I caught a glance out the window at what he'd been barking at. My eyes went wide with surprise, and I felt almost sick as I saw the figure of my new neighbor huddled tight against the wall of my house. He seemed to be waiting for something, as every few moments he poked his head out of his hiding spot. It didn't seem like he'd seen I'd noticed him yet. I immediately ran to get my friend, trying to stay as quietly as possible so as to not alert the man outside. I got to my friend and urged him to come with me to the window. My neighbor was still there when I got back, huddled against the wall and waiting for something. It was then that I realized what he'd been waiting for. The reason I felt him staring at me every night I'd gone out with my dog. He was waiting for me to head down the path back home. I felt sick thinking of what could have happened to me if I had gone out that night. I retreated further into the house as my friend began to video the neighbor outside. He made sure to get his face included as well, clearly showing that he was on my property without permission. We followed up by calling the police and quietly reporting the man waiting outside. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we heard the sirens outside and saw the flashing blue and red lights. We checked back on my neighbor's hiding spot, and we saw he had moved, though we hadn't seen where he'd gone to. The police were still approaching. Then we heard multiple bangs coming from the front door, along with the man yelling. I instantly knew it was the neighbor. I don't want to recite the things he said from the other side of the door, as I've tried tirelessly to push them out of my mind entirely. The banging continued until the sound of other voices could be heard outside. I could tell the police had finally arrived. Sometime after the situation had died down outside, one of the cars could be heard leaving my house, but another remained. Another knock at the door came, this time from a police officer. The officer asked some questions about what was going on. After we told him we'd called and I gave him the rundown of the situation and what happened in the days leading up to this point, I was trembling through it all as I held the fear inside of me from the encounter. After answering all the questions, we showed him the video of the man hiding next to my house, waiting for me. I also told him what I thought was going on. I'm glad the officer took the time to hear everything out that I had to say, He even wrote down most of it before leaving to report what I'd told him. He told me I didn't have to go to the station to give further information if I didn't want to. In the end, I didn't want to. I didn't want there to even be a chance of seeing my neighbor again. I went back inside where I fell asleep quickly on the couch, along with my friend, as he hadn't slept a wink the entire time he'd been with me. We got a nice long rest before we woke up the next morning. Little information came out about what happened until a few days later. I got word he'd been charged with trespassing, an attempt at breaking and entering. They said he would likely get very little jail time for this, but we could still get a restraining order against him. If he ever came close to me again, he'd be charged and sentenced to far more jail time than he was going to be serving now. This put me at ease a little bit. It felt like delayed comfort, as I knew a restraining order could mean very little to someone who didn't care to obey the law. That was, for the most part, my entire story, as at present time, my neighbor still sits behind bars for a little bit. Now, the house next door has picked right back up with what had been happening a few weeks prior. The commotion started once more, as people poured in the hopes of living there again. I'm kinda sick of the noise they were making daily, but that's not the worst thing for me. All I care about is that hopefully I get a better neighbor next time. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.